This game today shows why Alireza Firouzja is one of the top 5 players in the world. It shows what separates him from other very elite players who are smart, know the opening, know the middle game, can spot all of the tactics. But there are things that separate them, and this game shows it. Alireza Firouzja has the white pieces. Ivan Saric, who's rated 2680, has the black pieces. This is at the Super United Rapid. The time control is 25 minutes with a 10-second increment for each side. Alireza begins with the move e4. Ivan Saric plays c5. Knight f3, d6, knight c3, knight f6, h3, e5, bishop e7, d3. And what we have here really is almost more like a Spanish opening in a lot of ways, because we've got pawns on e4 and e5. Even though it started out as a Sicilian, the structure is quite different than most Sicilians. Castles, and Alireza plays knight to h2. Now, normally a move like this is designed to clear the way for the f-pawn to go to f4, get some activity on the f-file. But Alireza has a different idea in mind. Knight c6, knight to g4. The knight is on a very interesting journey, wants to go to e3 and help control the d5 square. In this position, if black takes, then after pawn takes, it opens up the h-file. This pawn is defended by the queen, and gives white some nice attacking potential. So black does not do that. Instead, he plays bishop to e6, challenging the bishop at c4. Knight to e3, completing that journey and helping to clamp down on the weak d5 square. Black plays the knight to d4, now castles and rook to b8. Ivan Saric wants to gain counterplay on the queen side by playing b5, by putting the rook behind the pawn, and the knight at d4 would also defend that pawn. a4 to prevent that, a6 to push it on through anyway. Knight to d5, knight c to d5, and b5, gaining that space and hitting the bishop at c4. Pawn takes. Now knight to f6 check, bishop f6, and bishop to d5. White wants a piece on that d5 square, preferably a knight versus a dark squared bishop, but he can't force that situation at the moment. And here black plays b4. He knows that in order to kick this knight out of d4, white's going to want to play c3, and when that happens, his rook will be on an open file. And that happens right away. c3, pawn takes, and black has control of the b file. White, of course, has the a file. Then he plays knight to b3, hitting the rook and the bishop, and white has to make a choice, and Firouzja plays bishop takes e6. Now you may ask, doesn't that allow black to just take the rook on a1? Well, there's a problem with that. First of all, Firouzja would play bishop to d5, and then if rook to b1 to defend that knight, because the knight really has nowhere to go. It only has b3 and c2, and both of those are controlled. But if rook to b1, then bishop to a2 kicks the rook out of the way. Rook b7, bishop to a3 clears the way for the queen to take the knight. And it looks like after rook to a7, black is going to be fine and going to regain a piece for the knight. But queen takes knight, rook takes a3, but then bishop f7 check wins the rook on a3, and white's up a pawn, but more importantly, his knight, when it lands on d5, will completely own this dark square bishop, and white's just winning probably in this position. So they don't go down that route. Instead, Ivan Saric, instead of taking the rook, takes the bishop with the pawn and plugs up these holes at d5 and f5, making it hard for the knight at e3 to go into them. Rook to b1, knight takes bishop, and after a few exchanges, we very quickly end up in an even heavy piece endgame, queen and rook versus queen and rook. But this is where we really see the separation between a 2790 player, 2800 player, and say a 2650, or even someone that's just 2700. These kinds of positions really separate that group. Let's watch how Firouzja proceeds here. Queen to h4 was played by Saric, hitting f2, rook to e1. The queen at b2, of course, defends that square for the time being. King h7, queen to e2, rook f6, rook a1, queen f4, c4, locking up this position. And these 3 pawns make it hard for these 4 pawns to advance. Rook f7, g3, queen f3, and now queen takes, rook takes. And black's attacking the d3 pawn. Now, white does not want to play rook to d1. That defends the pawn, but limits the rook's mobility. So instead, he plays the rook to a3, defending it laterally, but the rook has a lot more mobility from the a3 square. King to g6, king to g2, and the rook has to retreat. Rook to a6. Now, all of a sudden, Firouzja is the one putting pressure on black's weak pawn at d6. Rook to d7 defends it, and we see that rook is in that more passive position Firouzja was able to avoid. King f3, king f6, king g4 to penetrate on the king side. Ivan Saric prevents that from happening. H4, H5 check. The king has to move back. King to E7. So now Firouzja has to find a target. How does he get into black's position? Well, he plays G4 to start. HG4, King G4. He'd like to play the king to G5, put pressure on G6, but king to F6 prevents that king from getting into G5. Rook to B6, rook to D8, now rook to B7, controlling the 7th rank and limiting the mobility again of the king at F6. Rook to A8, rook to D7, attacking the D6 pawn. Rook to A6, defending it laterally. King to F3, rook to B6. Firouzja has to find a way to win this position if he can. King to E3, rook to A6, F3, rook to B6. He's just moving the rook back and forth, daring white to try to make progress in this position. King to D2, rook to B2, check, king to C3. Now, basically what he's done is given black a chance to make a mistake. And here, the best move for black is just rook back to B6. But instead, he sees an opportunity. He thinks he might be able to win. So Ivan Saric plays rook to F2, attacking the F3 pawn, but getting in a race with Firouzja. Rook takes D6, rook F3, rook C6, attacking the C5 pawn, rook H3. Now they are both in a race. Rook takes pawn, rook H4. Black wants to get the G pawn all the way to the queening square. White wants to get the C pawn all the way to the queening square. Rook to C8, G5, rook to G8. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. Rook H1, C5, rook to G1. King to B4, excuse me. The king wants to help escort this pawn to the queening square. King to F7 hits the rook. Rook H8, rook to C1 behind the pawn. King to B5, C6. And here, rook takes pawn would lose instantly to C7. And he would have to give up his rook after the pawn queens. So instead, king to E7 is played. Ivan Saric wants to use his king to help slow down the C6 pawn. Rook to H7 check first, and he plays king to D8. If he plays king to D6, then boom, rook to D7 would be checkmate. That's not a mistake he wants to make. So king to D8, rook to D7 check, king to C8, pushing the king away from the pawns, and now rook to D6, attacking white's E6 pawn. G4, rook E6, rook takes D5, rook takes D3, and rook takes E5, excuse me. And in this position, this is really one that separates the men from the boys. Firouzja sees, or excuse me, Ivan Saric makes the one mistake in the position, and it looks so natural. It looks like the right move to make. I mean, anybody in the same position would make it. G3. But it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is this sort of, and again, this is super GM stuff. The rook to D1 is the right move because he needs what's called maximum checking distance from his opponent's king. Here, after rook G5, rook to B1, check, you see there are 3 squares separating the rook and the king. That's what's called maximum checking distance. Anything less than that allows the king to fight back. And in this position, there are still 3 squares here to separate. So that would have been the drawing concept, and it basically just goes like this. After king C6, rook to D6 check, you'd have a drawn position. But after G3, rook to E5, now it doesn't work because rook to B3 check, there's only 1 square separating the king and the rook. And there's not sufficient checking distance. So king C4, now he can hit that rook and make progress with tempo. That's the real difference between the checking distance issue. Rook A3, rook to G7, controlling the rank. King to D8 and E5, and white would have a winning position right here. So, and you can see these players are very, very advanced. Rook to E3, king to B6, threatening checkmate, rook to G8 mate, rook to B3 check, and again, only 2 squares separate. You need 3. King to C5, rook to C3 check, king to D5, rook D3 check, then king to C4. Again, able to hit the rook. Rook to A3, rook to G7, continuing to keep this king pinned on the back rank. Rook to A1. If he tries to stay on the same rank with rook to E3, then just king over, rook A3, then E5. He's doing well. So rook to A1 to bring the rook behind the passed pawns. Rook takes pawn, king C7, rook to G6 to defend the pawn. But now rook to C1 check, king D5, rook D1, king E5, rook to E1. Now rook to E6. He places the rook in a position where it defends E5 and C6 simultaneously. So rook is being used to maximum effect. Rook H1, king F6, rook H6 check, king F7. And he doesn't want to trade rooks here because this is a winning king and pawn endgame for white. the king takes pawn, the pawn would just march. Then you have opposition. When the king moves, boom. That would be a win. Rook to h4, e5, rook to e4, rook again behind the passed pawn, king to f6, rook to f4 check, king g5, hits the rook to f1. He wants to control this file and keep this king from crossing over. Rook to d6, rook to f2, king g6, rook f1. Now rook to d2, rook to e1, because he doesn't want white to get behind this passed pawn with his own rook and support it going forward. So he gets behind the pawn. King to f6, rook to f1 check, king to e6, rook to h1. Now rook to c2 gets behind this pawn. Rook to h6 check. And again, insufficient checking distance. Only 2 squares, and white takes advantage of that. With king f7, rook h7, king g6, and he's able to hit that rook with his king. Rook to h1, e6, rook to g1 check, king to f7, rook f1 check, king to e8, rook e1, and now e7. And Firouzja is getting closer and closer to that queening square. And like I said, this is what separates the very high-level players from each other. Rook f1, rook h2, rook to f3. If he takes the pawn, then just king to d8, and the pawn will queen. Rook to f3, rook to d2, rook f1, rook to d7 check. He can't take the pawn because after king to d8, white just queens very easily. So king goes back to c8 and c7. And now rook to h1. And Ivan Saric sets up one last trap. He's threatening rook to h8 check, forcing the king over, and then king takes rook. And the rook and king would control the queening squares, and black would win. So before that happens, Firouzja plays rook to d8 check. After king c7, king to f7, and there is nothing to be done to keep the pawn from queening. He can check on f1, but then the king would just come down and eventually hit the rook, and then the pawn would queen. This is the most advanced game I think I've ever covered on this channel, maybe for a while. If you want to see another great game from Alireza Firouzja, check out this game right here. Actually, this game right here on this side of the screen. It won't be quite as complicated, maybe not as educational, but I think you'll enjoy it. See you again soon. Bye.